So when the Beatles released their debut single Love Me Do on Friday, October the 5th in 1962, no one, not the critics, not the fans, not even the band themselves, could have predicted the cultural detonation that was about to go off. You see, they weren't just another British rock band, they became the band. By the time they split up in 1970, they flipped the music industry on its head, reshaped global and youth culture, and basically invented the modern pop star. Music would never be the same again. And honestly, neither would we. But here's the insane part. The one thing that even some Beatles fans tend to forget, they did all of that. The albums, the tours, the controversies, the psychedelic detours, the rooftop goodbye in just 7 years. Yeah, I know. Don't come at me in the comments. Yeah, there were the Quarrymen days, and yeah, they did cut their teeth in Hamburg. But from Love Me Do to Let It Be, that's a 7-year run. 7 years that changed everything. So, how? How did four lads from Liverpool rewrite the rule book of modern music, challenge the establishment, and somehow leave that kind of legacy behind, all before they turn 30? Let's break it down. Oh, and just before we dive headfirst into the madness, please hit like, hit subscribe, and ring the bell just so you don't miss any of our deep dives into the legends that shaped music history. And before we start, for the record, 1962 to 1970 is technically 8 years, but from October the 5th, 1962 to April 10th, 1970, that's 7.5. And I'm rounding down because, well, 7 years just sounds cooler. Anyway, let's get into it. From day one, the Beatles worked at a breathtaking pace. In their early years, they played marathon live shows, notably in Hamburg, where they sometimes performed for up to 8 hours a night. This period honed their skills to a razor-sharp level. They hit the 10,000 hour mark before they even turned 30. These insane shows harnessed their abilities to a whole new level, far above other bands that were playing similar songs to them. It also gelled them as a group so deeply that they were almost like brothers. Yet, sorry, I've not forgotten you, Ringo. But once they broke through in Britain, their work rate only increased. 2 albums a year, multiple hit singles, relentless touring, press conferences, radio shows, and eventually films. By modern standards, their output is staggering. Just think about the big rock bands of our day. An album once every 2, 3, 4 years. It's completely unheard of to do 2 albums a year today. But this was just what their contract stated, so they had to meet these terms. It wasn't up for debate. And I suppose contextually back then, most groups had teams of songwriters and would populate their albums with cover songs. So it wasn't so hard to meet 2 albums a year when you were only really selling 1 or 2 songs packaged amongst 10 others. Artists back then weren't album driven, they were song driven. The Beatles were one of, if not the first, to really break out of that mold of driving the album into an artistic vision. Between 1963 and 1966 alone, they released 7 studio albums, each packed with original material, especially after Rubber Soul, while maintaining a punishing tour schedule that spanned continents. You see, this was the landscape of the music artist in the early 1960s. They never stopped. Equally astonishing is how rapidly the Beatles evolved musically. You see, early records like Please Please Me and A Hard Day's Night showcased infectious pop songs, simple but very rich in energy and melody. It was a step above, but also still very similar to other chart songs of its day. The Beatles wore their influences on their sleeve. They were inspired by American rock and roll, so that's what they wanted to release, with a little British twist. But however, by 1965's Rubber Soul, the songwriting matured dramatically, exploring deeper themes and more complex arrangements. A big thing was that they'd fallen in love with Bob Dylan's work.
He was our idol.
Bob was our hero.
Not an idol, but we just heard his record. As I said, we listened to his album and it really gave us a buzz, and we played it constantly over and over and over again.
And they were becoming more influenced by the folk scene and the shifting tides over in America. They shifted from love songs to introspective experimental works in just a few years. The hippie movement was growing, and so was the music.
Fucking hippie motherfuckers.
But the Beatles were fans of music, not just rock and roll, and they didn't want to be put into a box of what they could and couldn't do. A great song is a great song, whether it's got a loud, blaring guitar or it's John Lennon singing acoustically. And I think, for me, this refusal to be put into a box helped their work stay fresh and interesting. One of their major departures from the typical rock and roll sound they'd perfected, which was the 1966 masterpiece Revolver, introduced groundbreaking techniques such such as tape loops and reverse recording, Indian instrumentation. I think each Beatle had such a unique vision for how their songs should be played. George's obsession with Indian music mixed with Lennon's infatuation of trying to put down his feelings into poetry, but also mixed so well with like the experimentation that Paul was so eager to try out. But I can't go on without mentioning the genius of George Martin. George Martin's patience and expertise within the studio helped the Beatles get their visions down onto tape. You see, I think if they'd had a lesser producer, they may not have been able to express exactly how the song should sound and feel. From Revolver, they released 1 year later Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and this took the album's concept to new artistic heights, weaving together themes and styles in a way that turned pop music into a real art form. Each album didn't just build on the last, it exploded outward into new territory, influencing countless contemporaries and future artists. The Beatles almost benefited from, and kind of helped to define as well, the spirit of the 1960s. You see, they arrived as a youthful Britain was shaking off the grey 1950s post-war, and they were all hungry for something new and a bit more vibrant. Globally as well, the rise of television and mass media meant that Beatlemania could spread like wildfire. The world had never been more connected. Without the technology advances of the time, from like mass printing to television, the Beatles might have just remained a local phenomenon. But instead, they actually became the first truly global pop culture icons. They rode that wave of a rapidly changing new world. And as well, they arrived in America at a time of mourning after the assassination of Kennedy. And the Americans too were trying to find something new and exciting, because to them the world had never looked any bleaker. And the Beatles were the perfect antidote to this. They were cheeky and cheery, and the pop music was like so infectious. The Beatles moved with the times. They weren't going to become sticks in the mud, and became hippies and were inspired by LSD. The 60s were probably the most exciting time in history. It was a time when people really felt like change was going to happen, and the Beatles were icons in this movement. But to be honest, of course, no amount of hard work or good timing could have substituted the extraordinary chemistry between John, Paul, George and Ringo. Even with Ringo joining late into the group, he fit into their rapport so well. Lennon and McCartney formed one of the most potent songwriting partnerships ever in history, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses. McCartney's melodic optimism tempered with Lennon's biting wit and his cynicism, while Harrison's growing contributions as a songwriter added spiritual and musical depth, especially in the later albums. But meanwhile, Ringo's steady, inventive drumming provided the perfect foundation for the three songwriters to flourish. But the thing is, no member completely dominated. They all needed each other. It's their differences and the tensions, the occasional conflicts. That's all what fueled their creativity. It pushed them to keep evolving until the very friction that energized their music was the thing that also tore them apart. You see, they were more than a band, they were brothers. They each provided their unique role in the band. They couldn't go on without each other. Perhaps crucially, the most important thing is that the Beatles recognised when it was time to end. By 1969, the pressures of fame, creative disagreements, and the sort of different personal paths they were all taking had made it almost impossible to stay together. But rather than clinging to the past, they disbanded and each moved on to solo careers. The Beatles' breakup, which is still painful, preserved their legacy as a concentrated burst of brilliance rather than a slow decline. They didn't want to release bad music. When they felt that their creativity was pulling them apart, they disbanded. It's not unlike bands to look to reconcile under the enormous pressure of money and fan demand. But the Beatles weren't interested. They put their art and their creativity to the forefront of everything that they did. They knew by the end of 1969 that they had no more to say together. They could have taken a break and come back together in a couple of years, but they didn't, because the legacy of the band is that there are no bad albums. Take a look at the greatest bands of all time. They have their heyday, like, for example, the Rolling Stones, who really struck out between Beggar's Banquet and Exile on Main Street. But then look at the Stones in the late 70s into the 80s. They've got decades of music released for the sake of it. The Beatles don't have that. You can argue that the first few albums are a little bit weaker to their later albums. But the thing is, it's those albums that incited Beatlemania in the first place. You see, no matter what you say, you don't have a bad Beatles album. And because of that, that's why they remain timeless. And their impact's still so lasting. So in 7 short years, the Beatles rewrote the rule book for what popular music could be. They evolved from a lovable boy band into pioneering artists and left an indelible mark on culture itself. Despite so many amazing bands being born in the 60s, the Beatles always remained at the top, never faltering and always releasing breathtaking work that shook the world by storm. They worked harder, moved faster, and reached higher than anyone before or since. They were naturally brilliant, of course, but there was always more to it than that. Their story is a real reminder that when creativity, timing, and chemistry align, even for a brief moment, it can change the world forever. But I am sad to say that I don't think a band will ever do it again. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Really hope you appreciate this one and you like the Beatles content I'm putting out at the moment. Again, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does mean a lot to me. And once again, I'll see you in the next one.